The Story of Civilization, Volume 1, Our Oriental Heritage, Part 1, being a history of civilization in Egypt and the Near East to the death of Alexander, and in India, China, and Japan from the beginning to our own day, with an introduction on the nature and foundations of civilization, by Will Durant. Copyright 1935 by Will Durant. Copyright renewed 1963 by Will Durant. This recording of the full-length reading of Our Oriental Heritage was published by arrangement with Monica Ariel Mihel, Trustee Ethel B. Durant Trust, Monica Ariel Mihel and William James Durant Easton, and was produced in 1994 by Books on Tape Incorporated, which holds the copyright thereto. Neither this recording nor any part thereof may be reproduced or used for any purpose without prior written authority from Books on Tape Incorporated. This book is read by Alexander Adams. Please observe the following procedures as you listen to these tapes. If you have borrowed this book from your local library, please return it to them at the end of the agreed period. If you are one of our regular rental customers, you may keep this book for 30 days from date of receipt by you, but after that time we charge additional rental of 25 cents per day. Dates are checked by postmark. Please return this book at the earliest possible time so another subscriber can have the use of this recording. To return cassettes to us, make sure they are all packaged in their plastic cassette cases and in proper order in the mailing container. Kindly seal the mailing container for return. Postage is already paid. Drop in any mailbox for return to Books on Tape. Should a cassette fail to play properly, hold it flat in the palm of your hand and slap it smartly against a hard flat surface. If this does not work, or if you cannot otherwise free the reels, and if you are a library customer, please ask your local library to contact Books on Tape for a replacement cassette. If you are one of our rental customers, please call us at our regular customer service number. Give us the name of the book and number of the cassette. We will immediately send you a replacement at no charge. Discard the broken cassette. Our Oriental Heritage, Part 1, by Will Durant. This book consists of 31 chapters, and it is 933 pages long. The following material appears on the dust jacket of the book. Many years ago, before the days of the story of philosophy, Will Durant planned to write a history of the 19th century. He started to work on it, only to find that his subject could be understood only in terms of what had come before. His research gradually led him into the formation of a plan for writing a history of all civilization, ancient and modern, Occidental and Oriental. His enthusiasm was further spurred by 2 trips around the world, and particularly by an intensive study of the history of the Far East. Here, then, is the first volume of this story of civilization, Our Oriental Heritage, complete in itself. Dr. Durant worked on it steadily from 1927 to 1932, and the book represents the third complete rewriting. Our Oriental Heritage deals first with the establishment of civilization, and then takes up, not in rapid review but in rich and fascinating detail, the colorful, complex dramas of the Near East, India and her neighbors, and the Far East. The story is carried up to mid-1930s. Every one of the thousands of facts in Our Oriental Heritage has been checked and double-checked, but as a safeguard against possible errors, extra copies of the manuscript were made and sent to many specialists, including Professor Harry Wolfson of Harvard, Dr. Ananda Kumaraswamy of the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, and Professor H. Gowan of the University of Washington. This volume, then, begins with a chapter on the nature and conditions of civilization, offers a 109-page introduction on the establishment of civilization, an attempt to meet Voltaire's demand, "I want to know what were the steps by which men passed from barbarism to civilization." It goes on to record the cultural history, the economic and political organization, the science and art, the religion and morals, the literature and philosophy, the customs and manners of Sumeria, Egypt, Babylonia, Assyria, Judea, and Persia to their conquest by Alexander, and narrates the history of civilization in India, from the Vedas to Mahatma Gandhi, in China from Confucius to Chiang Kai-shek, and in Japan from the earliest times to mid-1930s. Those who have read Our Oriental Heritage have compared it, and the series of which it is a part, with the great work of the French encyclopedists of the 18th century. The story of civilization represents the most comprehensive attempt in our times to embrace the vast panorama of man's history and culture. Dedication to Ariel. Preface. I have tried in this book to accomplish the first part of a pleasant assignment which I rashly laid upon myself some 20 years ago. to write a history of civilization. I wish to tell as much as I can, in as little space as I can, of the contributions that genius and labor have made to the cultural heritage of mankind, to chronicle and contemplate in their causes, character, and effects the advances of invention, the varieties of economic organization, the experiments in government, the aspirations of religion, the mutations of morals and manners, the masterpieces of literature, the development of science, the wisdom of philosophy, and the achievements of art. I do not need to be told how absurd this enterprise is, nor how immodest is its very conception, for many years of effort have brought it to but a fifth of its completion, and have made it clear that no one mind and no single lifetime can adequately compass this task. Nevertheless, I have dreamed that despite the many errors inevitable in this undertaking, it may be of some use to those upon whom the passion for philosophy has laid the compulsion to try to see things whole, to pursue perspective, unity, and understanding through history in time, as well as to seek them through science in space. I have long felt that our usual method of writing history in separate longitudinal sections, economic history, political history, religious history, the history of philosophy, the history of literature, the history of science, the history of music, the history of art, does injustice to the unity of human life. That history should be written collaterally as well as lineally, synthetically as well as analytically, and that the ideal historiography would seek to portray in each period the total complex of a nation's culture, institutions, adventures, and ways. But the accumulation of knowledge has divided history, like science, into 1,000 isolated specialties. The prudent scholars have refrained from attempting any view of the whole, whether of the material universe or of the living past of our race. For the probability of error increases with the scope of the undertaking, and any man who sells his soul to synthesis will be a tragic target for a myriad merry darts of specialist critique. "Consider," said Ptahhotep 5,000 years ago, "how thou mayest be opposed by an expert in council. It is foolish to speak on every kind of work." A history of civilization shares the presumptuousness of every philosophical enterprise. It offers the ridiculous spectacle of a fragment expounding the whole. Like philosophy, such a venture has no rational excuse, and is at best but a brave stupidity. But let us hope that, like philosophy, it will always lure some rash spirits into its fatal depths. The plan of the series is to narrate the history of civilization in 5 independent parts. 1. Our Oriental Heritage, a history of civilization in Egypt and the Near East to the death of Alexander, and in India, China, and Japan to the present day, with an introduction on the nature and elements of civilization. 2. Our Classical Heritage, a history of civilization in Greece and Rome, and of civilization in the Near East under Greek and Roman domination. 3. Our Medieval Heritage, Catholic and feudal Europe, Byzantine civilization, Mohammedan and Judaic culture in Asia, Africa, and Spain, and the Italian Renaissance. 4. Our European Heritage, the cultural history of the European states from the Protestant Reformation to the French Revolution. 5. Our Modern Heritage, the history of European invention and statesmanship, science and philosophy, religion and morals, literature and art from the accession of Napoleon to our own times. Our story begins with the Orient, not merely because Asia was the scene of the oldest civilizations known to us, but because those civilizations formed the background and basis of that Greek and Roman culture which Sir Henry Maine mistakenly supposed to be the whole source of the modern mind. We shall be surprised to learn how much of our most indispensable inventions, our economic and political organization, our science and our literature, our philosophy and our religion, goes back to Egypt and the Orient. At this historic moment, when the ascendancy of Europe is so rapidly coming to an end, when Asia is swelling with resurrected life, and the theme of the 20th century seems destined to be an all-embracing conflict between the East and the West, the provincialism of our traditional histories, which began with Greece and summed up Asia in a line, has become no merely academic error, but a possibly fatal failure of perspective and intelligence. The future faces into the Pacific, and understanding must follow it there. But how shall an Occidental mind ever understand the Orient? 8 years of study and travel have only made this too more evident, that not even a lifetime of devoted scholarship would suffice to initiate a Western student into the subtle character and secret lore of the East. Every chapter, every paragraph in this book will offend or amuse some patriotic or esoteric soul. The Orthodox Jew will need all his ancient patience to forgive the pages on Yahweh. The metaphysical Hindu will mourn this superficial scratching of Indian philosophy, and the Chinese or Japanese sage will smile indulgently at these brief and inadequate selections from the wealth of Far Eastern literature and thought. Some of the errors in the chapter on Judea have been corrected by Professor Harry Wolfson of Harvard. Dr. Ananda Kumaraswamy of the Boston University of Fine Arts has given the section on India a most painstaking revision, but must not be held responsible for the conclusions I have reached or the errors that remain. Professor H. Gowan, the learned Orientalist of the University of Washington, and Upton Close, whose knowledge of the Orient seems inexhaustible, have checked the more flagrant mistakes in the chapters on China and Japan. And Mr. George Sokolsky has given to the pages on contemporary affairs in the Far East the benefit of his first-hand information. Should the public be indulgent enough to call for a second edition of this book, the opportunity will be taken to incorporate whatever further corrections may be suggested by critics, specialists, and readers. Meanwhile, a weary author may sympathize with Tai Tung, who in the 13th century issued his History of Chinese Writing with these words, "Were I to await perfection, my book would never be finished." Since these ear-minded times are not propitious for the popularity of expensive books on remote subjects of interest only to citizens of the world, it may be that the continuation of this series will be delayed by the prosaic necessities of economic life. But if the reception of this adventure in synthesis makes possible an uninterrupted devotion to the undertaking, Part 2 should be ready by the fall of 1940, and its successors should appear, by the grace of health, at 5-year intervals thereafter. Nothing would make me happier than to be freed for this work from every other literary enterprise. I shall proceed as rapidly as time and circumstance will permit, hoping that a few of my contemporaries will care to grow old with me while learning, and that these volumes may help some of our children to understand and enjoy the infinite riches of their inheritance. Will Durant, Great Neck, New York, March 1935. Acknowledgments. I am grateful to the following authors and publishers for permission to quote from their books: W. E. Leonard, Gilgamesh, The Viking Press; H. A. Giles, A History of Chinese Literature, D. Appleton Century Company; Edna Worthley Underwood, Tu Fu, The Mosher Press; Arthur Whaley, 170 Chinese Poems, Alfred A. Knopf; James H. Breasted, The Development of Religion and Thought in Ancient Egypt, Scribner's; Shigeyoshi Obata, Works of Li Po, E. P. Dutton; Eunice Tietjens, Poetry of the Orient, Alfred A. Knopf; Mark Van Doren, Anthology of World Poetry, The Literary Guild; Upton Close, Unpublished Translations of Chinese Poems. Introduction. The Establishment of Civilization. I want to know what were the steps by which men passed from barbarism to civilization. Voltaire. Chapter 1. The Conditions of Civilization. Definition: geological conditions, geographical, economic, racial, psychological, causes of the decay of civilizations. Civilization is social order promoting cultural creation. 4 elements constitute it: economic provision, political organization, moral traditions, and the pursuit of knowledge and the arts. It begins where chaos and insecurity end. For when fear is overcome, curiosity and constructiveness are free, and man passes by natural impulse towards the understanding and embellishment of life. Certain factors condition civilization and may encourage or impede it. First, geological conditions. Civilization is an interlude between ice ages. At any time the current of glaciation may rise again, cover with ice and stone the works of man, and reduce life to some narrow segment of the earth. Or the demon of earthquake, by whose leave we build our cities, may shrug his shoulders and consume us indifferently. Second, geographical conditions. The heat of the tropics and the innumerable parasites that infest them are hostile to civilization. Lethargy and disease and a precocious maturity and decay divert the energies from those inessentials of life that make civilization and absorb them in hunger and reproduction. Nothing is left for the play of the arts and the mind. Rain is necessary, for water is the medium of life, more important even than the light of the sun. The unintelligible whim of the elements may condemn to desiccation regions that once flourished with empire and industry, like Nineveh or Babylon, or may help to swift strength and wealth cities apparently off the main line of transport and communication, like those of Great Britain or Puget Sound. If the soil is fertile in food or minerals, if rivers offer an easy advantage of exchange, if the coastline is indented with natural harbors for a commercial fleet, If, above all, a nation lies on the high road of the world's trade, like Athens or Carthage, Florence or Venice, then geography, though it can never create it, smiles upon civilization and nourishes it. Economic conditions are more important. A people may possess ordered institutions, a lofty moral code, and even a flair for the minor forms of art, like the American Indians. And yet, if it remains in the hunting stage, if it depends for its existence upon the precarious fortunes of the chase, it will never quite pass from barbarism to civilization. A nomad stock, like the Bedouins of Arabia, may be exceptionally intelligent and vigorous. It may display high qualities of character, like courage, generosity, and nobility. But without that simple sine qua non of culture, a continuity of food, its intelligence will be lavished on the perils of the hunt and the tricks of trade, and nothing will remain for the laces and frills, the curtsies and amenities, the arts and comforts of civilization. The first form of culture is agriculture. It is when man settles down to till the soil and lay up provisions for the uncertain future that he finds time and reason to be civilized. Within that little circle of security, a reliable supply of water and food, he builds his huts, his temples, and his schools. He invents productive tools and domesticates the dog, the ass, the pig, and at last himself. He learns to work with regularity and order, maintains a longer tenure of life, and transmits more completely than before the mental and moral heritage of his race. Culture suggests agriculture, but civilization suggests the city. In one aspect, civilization is the habit of civility, and civility is the refinement which townsmen, who made the word, thought possible only in the civitas, or city. The word civilization, Latin civilis, pertaining to the civis, citizen, is comparatively young. Despite Boswell's suggestion, Johnson refused to admit it to his dictionary in 1772. He preferred to use the word civility. For in the city are gathered, rightly or wrongly, the wealth and brains produced in the countryside. In the city, invention and industry multiply comforts, luxuries, and leisure. In the city, traders meet and barter goods and ideas. In that cross-fertilization of minds, at the crossroads of trade, intelligence is sharpened and stimulated to creative power. In the city, some men are set aside from the making of material things and produce science and philosophy, literature and art. Civilization begins in the peasant's hut, but it comes to flower only in the towns. There are no racial conditions to civilization. It may appear on any continent and in any color. At Pekin or Delhi, at Memphis or Babylon, at Ravenna or London, in Peru or Yucatan. It is not the great race that makes the civilization. It is the great civilization that makes the people. Circumstances geographical and economic create a culture, and the culture creates a type. The Englishman does not make British civilization. It makes him. If he carries it with him wherever he goes and dresses for dinner in Timbuktu, it is not that he is creating his civilization there anew, but that he acknowledges even there its mastery over his soul. Given like material conditions, and another race would beget like results. Japan reproduces in the 20th century the history of England in the 19th. Civilization is related to race only in the sense that it is often preceded by the slow intermarriage of different stocks and their gradual assimilation into a relatively homogeneous people. Blood, as distinct from race, may affect a civilization in the sense that a nation may be retarded or advanced by breeding from the biologically, not racially, worse or better strains among the people. These physical and biological conditions are only prerequisites to civilization. They do not constitute or generate it. Subtle psychological factors must enter into play. There must be political order, even if it be so near to chaos as in Renaissance Florence or Rome. Men must feel, by and large, that they need not look for death or taxes at every turn. There must be some unity of language to serve as a medium of mental exchange. Through church or family or school or otherwise, there must be a unifying moral code, some rules of the game of life acknowledged even by those who violate them, and giving to conduct some order and regularity, some direction and stimulus. Perhaps there must also be some unity of basic belief, some faith, supernatural or utopian, that lifts morality from calculation to devotion, and gives life nobility and significance despite our mortal brevity. And finally, there must be education, some technique, however primitive, for the transmission of culture. Whether through imitation, initiation, or instruction, whether through father or mother, teacher or priest, the lore and heritage of the tribe, its language and knowledge, its morals and manners, its technology and arts, must be handed down to the young as the very instrument through which they are turned from animals into men. The disappearance of these conditions, sometimes of even one of them, may destroy a civilization. A geological cataclysm or a profound climatic change, an uncontrolled epidemic like that which wiped out half the population of the Roman Empire under the Antonines, or the Black Death that helped to end the feudal age, the exhaustion of the land or the ruin of agriculture through the exploitation of the country by the town, resulting in a precarious dependence upon foreign food supplies, the failure of natural resources, either of fuels or of raw materials, a change in trade routes, leaving a nation off the main line of the world's commerce, mental or moral decay from the strange stimuli and contacts of urban life, from the breakdown of traditional sources of social discipline and the inability to replace them, the weakening of the stock by a disorderly sexual life, or by an Epicurean, pessimist, or quietist philosophy, the decay of leadership through the infertility of the able and the relative smallness of the families that might bequeath most fully the cultural inheritance of the race, a pathological concentration of wealth leading to class wars, disruptive revolutions, and financial exhaustion. These are some of the ways in which a civilization may die. For civilization is not something inborn or imperishable. It must be acquired anew by every generation, and any serious interruption in its financing or its transmission may bring it to an end. Man differs from the beast only by education, which may be defined as the technique of transmitting civilization. Civilizations are the generations of the racial soul. As family rearing and then writing bound the generations together, handing down the lore of the dying to the young, so print and commerce and 1,000 ways of communication may bind the civilizations together and preserve for future cultures all that is of value for them in our own. Let us, before we die, gather up our heritage and offer it to our children. Chapter 2. The Economic Elements of Civilization. Despite recent high example to the contrary, the word civilization will be used in this volume to mean social organization, moral order, and cultural activity, while culture will mean, according to the context, either the practice of manners and the arts, or the sum total of a people's institutions, customs, and arts. It is in the latter sense that the word culture will be used in reference to primitive or prehistoric societies. In one important sense, the savage, too, is civilized, for he carefully transmits to his children the heritage of the tribe, that complex of economic, political, mental, and moral habits and institutions which it has developed in its efforts to maintain and enjoy itself on the earth. It is impossible to be scientific here, for in calling other human beings savage or barbarous we may be expressing no objective fact, but only our fierce fondness for ourselves, and our timid shyness in the presence of alien ways. Doubtless we underestimate these simple peoples, who have so much to teach us in hospitality and morals. If we list the bases and constituents of civilization, we shall find that the naked nations invented or arrived at all but one of them, and left nothing for us to add except embellishments and writing. Perhaps they, too, were once civilized, and desisted from it as a nuisance. We must make sparing use of such terms as savage and barbarous in referring to our contemporaneous ancestry. Preferably, we shall call primitive all tribes that make little or no provision for unproductive days and little or no use of writing. In contrast, the civilized may be defined as literate providers. 1. From hunting to tillage. Primitive improvidence, beginnings of provision, hunting and fishing, herding, the domestication of animals, agriculture, food, cooking, cannibalism. 3 meals a day are a highly advanced institution. Savages gorge themselves or fast. The wilder tribes among the American Indians considered it weak-kneed and unseemly to preserve food for the next day. The natives of Australia are incapable of any labor whose reward is not immediate. Every Hottentot is a gentleman of leisure, and with the Bushmen of Africa it is always either a feast or a famine. There is a mute wisdom in this improvidence, as in many savage ways. The moment man begins to take thought of the morrow, he passes out of the Garden of Eden into the vale of anxiety. The pale cast of worry settles down upon him, greed is sharpened, property begins, and the good cheer of the thoughtless native disappears. The American Negro is making this transition today. "Of what are you thinking?" Peary asked one of his Eskimo guides. "I do not have to think," was the answer. "I have plenty of meat." Not to think unless we have to. There is much to be said for this as the summation of wisdom. Nevertheless, there were difficulties in this carelessness, and those organisms that outgrew it came to possess a serious advantage in the struggle for survival. The dog that buried the bone which even a canine appetite could not manage, the squirrel that gathered nuts for a later feast, the bees that filled the comb with honey, the ants that laid up stores for a rainy day, these were among the first creators of civilization. It was they, or other subtle creatures like them, who taught our ancestors the art of providing for tomorrow out of the surplus of today, or of preparing for winter in summer's time of plenty. With what skill those ancestors ferreted out from land and sea the food that was the basis of our simple societies. They grubbed edible things from the earth with bare hands. They imitated or used the claws and tusks of the animals, and fashioned tools out of ivory, bone, or stone. They made nets and traps and snares of rushes or fiber, and devised innumerable artifices for fishing and hunting their prey. The Polynesians had nets 1,000 ells long, which could be handled only by 100 men. In such ways, economic provision grew hand in hand with political organization, and the united quest for food helped to generate the state. The Tlingit fisherman put upon his head a cap like the head of a seal, and hiding his body among the rocks made a noise like a seal. Seals came toward him, and he speared them with the clear conscience of primitive war. Many tribes threw narcotics into the streams to stupefy the fish into cooperation with the fishermen. The Tahitians, for example, put into the water an intoxicating mixture prepared from the huteo nut or the hora plant. The fish, drunk with it, floated leisurely on the surface and were caught at the angler's will. Australian natives, swimming under water while breathing through a reed, pulled ducks beneath the surface by the legs and gently held them there till they were pacified. The Tarahumaras caught birds by stringing kernels on tough fibers half buried under the ground. The birds ate the kernels, and the Tarahumaras ate the birds. Hunting is now to most of us a game, whose relish seems based upon some mystic remembrance in the blood of ancient days when to hunter as well as hunted it was a matter of life and death. For hunting was not merely a quest for food. It was a war for security and mastery, a war beside which all the wars of recorded history are but a little noise. In the jungle, man still fights for his life, for though there is hardly an animal that will attack him unless it is desperate for food or cornered in the chase, yet there is not always food for all, and sometimes only the fighter or the breeder of fighters is allowed to eat. We see in our museums the relics of that war of the species in the knives, clubs, spears, arrows, lassos, bolas, lures, traps, boomerangs, and slings with which primitive men won possession of the land and prepared to transmit to an ungrateful posterity the gift of security from every beast except man. Even today, after all these wars of elimination, how many different populations move over the earth? Sometimes, during a walk in the woods, one is awed by the variety of languages spoken there, by the myriad species of insects, reptiles, carnivores, and birds. One feels that man is an interloper on this crowded scene, that he is the object of universal dread and endless hostility. Some day, perhaps, these chattering quadrupeds, these ingratiating centipedes, these insinuating bacilli, will devour man and all his works, and free the planet from this marauding biped, these mysterious and unnatural weapons, these careless feet. Hunting and fishing were not stages in economic development. They were modes of activity designed to survive into the highest forms of civilized society. Once the center of life, they are still its hidden foundations. Behind our literature and philosophy, our ritual and art, stand the stout killers of Packingtown. We do our hunting by proxy, not having the stomach for honest killing in the fields, but our memories of the chase linger in our joyful pursuit of anything weak or fugitive, in the games of our children, even in the word game. In the last analysis, civilization is based upon the food supply. The cathedral and the capitol, the museum and the concert chamber, the library and the university are the facade. In the rear are the shambles. To live by hunting was not original. If man had confined himself to that, he would have been just another carnivore. He began to be human when out of the uncertain hunt he developed the greater security and continuity of the pastoral life. For this involved advantages of high importance, the domestication of animals, the breeding of cattle, and the use of milk. We do not know how or when domestication began, perhaps when the helpless young of slain beasts were spared and brought to the camp as playthings for the children. The animal continued to be eaten, but not so soon. It acted as a beast of burden, but it was accepted almost democratically into the society of man, It became his comrade and formed with him a community of labor and residence. The miracle of reproduction was brought under control, and 2 captives were multiplied into a herd. Animal milk released women from prolonged nursing, lowered infantile mortality, and provided a new and dependable food. Population increased, life became more stable and orderly, and the mastery of that timid parvenu, man, became more secure on the earth. Meanwhile, woman was making the greatest economic discovery of all, the bounty of the soil. While man hunted, she grubbed about the tent or hut for whatever edible things lay ready to her hand on the ground. In Australia, it was understood that during the absence of her mate on the chase, the wife would dig for roots, pluck fruit and nuts from the trees, and collect honey, mushrooms, seeds, and natural grains. Even today, in certain tribes of Australia, the grains that grow spontaneously out of the earth are harvested without any attempt to separate and sow the seed. The Indians of the Sacramento River Valley never advanced beyond this stage. We shall never discover when men first noted the function of the seed and turned collecting into sowing. Such beginnings are the mysteries of history, about which we may believe and guess, but cannot know. It is possible that when men began to collect unplanted grains, seeds fell along the way between field and camp and suggested at last the great secret of growth. The Judeans threw the seeds together into the ground, leaving them to find their own way up. The natives of Borneo put the seed into holes which they dug with a pointed stick as they walked the fields. The simplest known culture of the earth is with this stick, or digger. In Madagascar 50 years ago, the traveler could still see women armed with pointed sticks, standing in a row like soldiers, and then at a signal, digging their sticks into the ground, turning over the soil, throwing in the seed, stamping the earth flat, and passing on to another furrow. The second stage in complexity was culture with the hoe. The digging stick was tipped with bone and fitted with a crosspiece to receive the pressure of the foot. When the conquistadors arrived in Mexico, they found that the Aztecs knew no other tool of tillage than the hoe. With the domestication of animals and the forging of metals, a heavier implement could be used. The hoe was enlarged into a plow, and the deeper turning of the soil revealed a fertility in the earth that changed the whole career of man. Wild plants were domesticated, new varieties were developed, old varieties were improved. Finally, nature taught man the art of provision, the virtue of prudence, the concept of time. Watching woodpeckers storing acorns in the trees, and the bees storing honey in hives, man conceived, perhaps after millenniums of improvident savagery, the notion of laying up food for the future. He found ways of preserving meat by smoking it, salting it, freezing it. Better still, he built granaries, secure from rain and damp, vermin and thieves, and gathered food into them for the leaner months of the year. Slowly it became apparent that agriculture could provide a better and steadier food supply than hunting. With that realization, man took one of the 3 steps that led from the beast to civilization: speech, agriculture, and writing. It is not to be supposed that man passed suddenly from hunting to tillage. Many tribes, like the American Indians, remained permanently becalmed in the transition, the men given to the chase, the women tilling the soil. Not only was the change presumably gradual, but it was never complete. Man merely added a new way of securing food to an old way, and for the most part throughout his history he has preferred the old food to the new. We picture early man experimenting with 1,000 products of the earth to find, at much cost to his inward comfort, which of them could be eaten safely, mingling these more and more with the fruits and nuts, the flesh and fish he was accustomed to, but always yearning for the booty of the chase. Primitive peoples are ravenously fond of meat, even when they live mainly on cereals, vegetables, and milk. If they come across the carcass of a recently dead animal, the result is likely to be a wild debauch. Very often no time is wasted on cooking. The prey is eaten raw, as fast as good teeth can tear and devour it. Soon nothing is left but the bones. Whole tribes have been known to feast for a week on a whale thrown up on the shore. Though the Fuegians can cook, they prefer their meat raw. When they catch a fish, they kill it by biting it behind the gills, and then consume it from head to tail without further ritual. The uncertainty of the food supply made these nature peoples almost literally omnivorous. Shellfish, sea urchins, frogs, toads, snails, mice, rats, spiders, earthworms, scorpions, moths, centipedes, locusts, caterpillars, lizards, snakes, boas, dogs, horses, roots, lice, insects, larvae, the eggs of reptiles and birds, there is not one of these but was somewhere a delicacy or even a pièce de résistance to primitive men. Some tribes are expert hunters of ants. Others dry insects in the sun and store them for a feast. Others pick the lice out of one another's hair and eat them with relish. If a great number of lice can be gathered to make a petite marmite, They are devoured with shouts of joy as enemies of the human race. The menu of the lower hunting tribes hardly differs from that of the higher apes. The discovery of fire limited this indiscriminate voracity and cooperated with agriculture to free man from the chase. Cooking broke down the cellulose and starch of 1,000 plants indigestible in their raw state, and man turned more and more to cereals and vegetables as his chief reliance. At the same time, cooking, by softening tough foods, reduced the need of chewing and began that decay of the teeth which is one of the insignia of civilization. To all the varied articles of diet that we have enumerated, man added the greatest delicacy of all, his fellow man. Cannibalism was at one time practically universal. It has been found in nearly all primitive tribes, and among such later peoples as the Irish, the Iberians, the Picts, and the 11th century Danes. Among many tribes, human flesh was a staple of trade, and funerals were unknown. In the Upper Congo, living men, women, and children were bought and sold frankly as articles of food. On the island of New Britain, human meat was sold in shops, as butcher's meat is sold among ourselves. And in some of the Solomon Islands, human victims, preferably women, were fattened for a feast like pigs. The Fuegians ranked women above dogs because they said dogs taste of otter. In Tahiti, an old Polynesian chief explained his diet to Pierre Loti. The white man, when well roasted, tastes like a ripe banana. The Fijians, however, complained that the flesh of the whites was too salty and tough, and that a European sailor was hardly fit to eat, but Polynesian tasted better. What was the origin of this practice? There is no surety that the custom arose, as formerly supposed, out of a shortage of other food. If it did, the taste, once formed, survived the shortage and became a passionate predilection. Everywhere among nature peoples, blood is regarded as a delicacy, never with horror. Even primitive vegetarians take to it with gusto. Human blood is constantly drunk by tribes otherwise kindly and generous, sometimes as medicine, sometimes as a rite or covenant, often in the belief that it will add to the drinker the vital force of the victim. No shame was felt in preferring human flesh. Primitive man seems to have recognized no distinction in morals between eating men and eating other animals. In Melanesia, the chief who could treat his friends to a dish of roast man soared in social esteem. "When I have slain an enemy," explained a Brazilian philosopher chief, "it is surely better to eat him than to let him waste. The worst is not to be eaten, but to die. If I am killed, it is all the same whether my tribal enemy eats me or not. But I could not think of any game that would taste better than he would. You whites are really too dainty." Doubtless the custom had certain social advantages. It anticipated Dean Swift's plan for the utilization of superfluous children, and it gave the old an opportunity to die usefully. There is a point of view from which funerals seem an unnecessary extravagance. To Montaigne, it appeared more barbarous to torture a man to death under the cover of piety, as was the mode of his time, than to roast and eat him after he was dead. We must respect one another's delusions. 2. The foundations of industry: fire, primitive tools, weaving and pottery, building and transport, trade and finance. If man began with speech and civilization with agriculture, industry began with fire. Man did not invent it. Probably nature produced the marvel for him by the friction of leaves or twigs, a stroke of lightning, or a chance union of chemicals. Man merely had the saving wit to imitate nature and to improve upon her. He put the wonder to 1,000 uses. First, perhaps, he made it serve as a torch to conquer his fearsome enemy, the dark. Then he used it for warmth, and moved more freely from his native tropics to less enervating zones, slowly making the planet human. Then he applied it to metals, softening them, tempering them, and combining them into forms stronger and suppler than those in which they had come to his hand. So beneficent and strange was it that fire always remained a miracle to primitive man, fit to be worshipped as a god. He offered it countless ceremonies of devotion and made it the center or focus, which is Latin for hearth, of his life and home. He carried it carefully with him as he moved from place to place in his wanderings, and would not willingly let it die. Even the Romans punished with death the careless Vestal Virgin who allowed the sacred fire to be extinguished. Meanwhile, in the midst of hunting, herding, and agriculture, invention was busy, and the primitive brain was racking itself to find mechanical answers to the economic puzzles of life. At first man was content, apparently, to accept what nature offered him, the fruits of the earth as his food, the skins and furs of the animals as his clothing, the caves and the hillsides as his home. Then, perhaps, for most history is guessing, and the rest is prejudice, he imitated the tools and industry of the animal. He saw the monkey flinging rocks and fruit upon his enemies, or breaking open nuts and oysters with a stone. He saw the beaver building a dam, the birds making nests and bowers, the chimpanzees raising something very like a hut. He envied the power of their claws, teeth, tusks, and horns, and the toughness of their hides, and he set to work to fashion tools and weapons that would resemble and rival these. Man, said Franklin, is a tool-using animal, but this too, like the other distinctions on which we plume ourselves, is only a difference of degree. Many tools lay potential in the plant world that surrounded primitive man. From the bamboo he made shafts, knives, needles, and bottles. Out of branches he made tongs, pincers, and vices. From bark and fibers he wove cord and clothing of 100 kinds. Above all, he made himself a stick. It was a modest invention, but its uses were so varied that man always looked upon it as a symbol of power and authority. From the wand of the fairies and the staff of the shepherd to the rod of Moses or Aaron, the ivory cane of the Roman consul, the lituus of the augurs, and the mace of the magistrate or the king. In agriculture, the stick became the hoe. In war, it became the lance or javelin or spear, the sword or bayonet. Again, man used the mineral world and shaped stones into a museum of arms and implements. Hammers, anvils, kettles, scrapers, arrowheads, saws, planes, wedges, levers, axes, and drills. From the animal world he made ladles, spoons, vases, gourds, plates, cups, razors, and hooks out of the shells of the shore, and tough or dainty tools out of the horn or ivory, the teeth and bones, the hair and hide of the beasts. Most of these fashioned articles had handles of wood attached to them in cunning ways, bound with braids of fiber or cords of animal sinew, and occasionally glued with strange mixtures of blood. The ingenuity of primitive men probably equaled, perhaps it surpassed, that of the average modern man. We differ from them through the social accumulation of knowledge, materials, and tools, rather than through innate superiority of brains. Indeed, nature men delight in mastering the necessities of a situation with inventive wit. It was a favorite game among the Eskimos to go off into difficult and deserted places and rival one another in devising means for meeting the needs of a life unequipped and unadorned. This primitive skill displayed itself proudly in the art of weaving. Here, too, the animal showed man the way. The web of the spider, the nest of the bird, the crossing and texture of fibers and leaves, and the natural embroidery of the woods set an example so obvious that in all probability weaving was one of the earliest arts of the human race. Bark, leaves, and grass fibers were woven into clothing, carpets, and tapestry, sometimes so excellent that it could not be rivaled today, even with the resources of contemporary machinery. Aleutian women may spend a year in weaving one robe. The blankets and garments made by the North American Indians were richly ornamented with fringes and embroideries of hairs and tendon threads dyed in brilliant colors with berry juice. Colors so alive, says Father Théodule, that ours do not seem even to approach them. Again, art began where nature left off. The bones of birds and fishes and the slim shoots of the bamboo tree were polished into needles, and the tendons of animals were drawn into threads delicate enough to pass through the eye of the finest needle today. Bark was beaten into mats and cloths, skins were dried for clothing and shoes, fibers were twisted into the strongest yarn, and supple branches and colored filaments were woven into baskets more beautiful than any modern forms. Akin to basketry, perhaps born of it, was the art of pottery. This book is continued at this point on the other side of this cassette. Please reverse or turn the cassette over now.